Good morning, seventh grade, and welcome to your lesson for Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Can you believe it? We are ready to start the last chapter of the book. Now, when we read chapter 11 over the last couple lessons, we covered a ton of ground. So if you remember, when we started the book, we talked about how Across 5 Aprils means across 5 years, that the Civil War covered 5 years. The beginning of our book seemed to take a long time. We didn't seem to cover a whole lot of time. And then chapter 11 started in September of 1863, and that chapter ended in November of 1864. So it covered a year and 2 months in one chapter. And now when we start this next chapter, we're going to be in December of 64. So to actually get to that 5th year, we only have a few more months left. So we're closing in on the end of the war, finding out what's going to happen with Jethro's family. Let's take a look at the questions that we have for chapter 12. There are 8, and there are 9. Once again, we probably won't get through all of them today because I'm going to keep it at a 20-minute. So we'll take a look at the first 4 or 5 questions, whether or not we even get through those today. Question 1, what was Sherman's gift to Lincoln? 2, what did Ed Turner think of the soldiers looting? 3, what were Ross Milton's thoughts about peace? And 4, what were Ross Milton's thoughts about the 13th Amendment? Now, I am going to point out that Ross Milton speaks quite eloquently and poetically, and you need to be able to explain, not only put down in words what it is he says specifically, but what does he mean by that? And I'll do my best to try to help you with that as we read through that part of the chapter. So in your book, if you would please turn to page 174, and we are going to start reading the last chapter, chapter 12. Still, there was no word of Sherman and the lost army of the Tennessee. All over the country, and in Europe too, people waited for word as they tried to guess what was happening. If he can do it, people said, if he can march 300 miles through enemy territory, then it is certain that the Confederacy is nearly spent. If Sherman can do it, then surely the war must be very near its close. But many remembered that Sherman had always been considered a little crazy. He looked wild. It was like him to attempt a mad, impossible feat like this. But Grant trusts him, some said. Yes, replied others, and Grant has made any number of mistakes, too. He's Mr. Big with old Abe, but that doesn't mean that he's always right. Suddenly, in December, the waiting was over, and the Army of the Tennessee was again in contact with Washington. I beg to present you the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift, Sherman wired the president. So remember, no telephones. He had to send like a telegraph message. And by saying that he's giving him the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift means that they've taken over that city. So it's theirs. The Union has won that. Quick word followed that the Army of the Tennessee had marched from Atlanta to the sea and had met hardly more than a brush of resistance. It was a signal for great rejoicing in the North. Then, during the next weeks, stories about Sherman's march began filtering back. This is what I started to hint towards yesterday. I had the wrong part. So this is that part that were kind of, some atrocities occurred and people were very surprised by it. We'll read about some of those. First, to the eastern cities and then to the Midwest. They traveled to the quiet farms where barns were full of grain and fat stock, where smokehouses were crammed with hams and sides of beef, where apples, cabbages, and potatoes were buried under mounds of earth and straw for winter use, where homes were warm in bitter weather and children slept safely through the nights in feather beds. Out in the Midwest, the railroads were intact and carried the farmers' grain and stock to the market. Trade was good and prices high. Throughout this part of the country, the farms lay tranquil, quiet, under the winter snow. waiting for spring and the plow and the stir of new life. People on these farms and in the cities received the stories coming up from Georgia with mixed reactions. The talk among the men who came to visit with Matt at his fireside was all of Billy Sherman's march through Georgia. The Rebs fired on their country's flag. They've held on for all these months and years, and hundreds of thousands of boys have been lost to save the Union their great-grandfathers established. Don't talk to me of mercy. Billy Sherman is giving them the mercy they deserve. My boy wrote that it was like a picnic all the way. They ate chicken and pork chops and yams every meal if they wanted them. They hadn't had grub like that in months. And they burned every fence and house and barn in sight. The railroads they bent up like hairpins, over 200 miles of them. So I'm not sure if you're understanding what happened here. As the boys marched, as they're crossing all of this countryside, it's not just walking and taking the city. They are causing destruction along the way. They're stealing food. Once they go through, they're burning down these houses, even though these people are just innocent civilians. And then the railroads, they're wanting to make sure that the trains can't get through. So they're bending the railroads up so that the trains can't get through to provide food and provision. So they're getting it easy because they're stealing it, and they're not being very kind along the way. They're taking everything and then they're destroying everything in their wake. Okay, let's continue. A war ain't one that leaves scars like this on folks who be our brothers. Have you heard of Andersonville prison? Do you know what the Rebs have done in that black hole to their brothers? Well, there's Camp Douglas right here in Illinois. Have you heard the stories of that place? So the stories of war and the things that men do, it's not always good. It's war. It's a terrible thing. It's a pitiful thing, but it's war. The sooner we make one great swoop, the sooner the suffering is over for all of us, south as well as north. There be limits, even in war. This was mean, mad destruction. This was war on babies and their mothers, on the sick and the old and helpless. And they brought it on themselves. They have to pay the price. Would their armies have spared us if the tables had been turned? Don't believe it for 1 minute. Word came that the Army of the Tennessee, after reaching Savannah, had turned north to join Grant. It was then that South Carolina knew the lash of a triumphant army drunk with the plundering of Georgia and enraged at the stubborn tenacity of the South in holding on to a cause that was already lost. In South Carolina, the vast, undisciplined army could find another excuse for its excesses beyond the slogan, "This is war, and war is hell." The role of this state in bringing on the war served as a just excuse for atrocities that no thoughtful man could excuse. This is the nest where secession was hatched. So South Carolina was where it started, where the idea of succession came through. So as the army is marching back up north, even after they've won this part of it, they're not going to be kind as they go through South Carolina. I lost my spot. Where did it say that? Oh, there it is, halfway down. The army shouted, and the proud possessions of a gracious life, the little homes of the poor, the cities, farms, and the frightened, desperate people were swept down before the fury of the Army of the Tennessee. Ed Turner's youngest boy, just 18, and in the Army only a few months, was in South Carolina. Ed brought the boy's letter down for Matt to read. In it, the boy told of the burning of Columbia and of how the soldiers laughed as a great wind fanned the flames, of the loot carried off, of mirrors and pianos smashed, and of intimate family treasures scattered to the winds by men who seemed to have gone mad. Ed Turner's hands trembled as he returned the letter to its envelope. What is this going to do to an 18-year-old boy, Matt? Can a lad come through weeks of this kind of actions without becoming a hardened man? Is human life going to be forever cheap to him and decency something to mock at? You and Mary have learned him right from wrong, Ed. But they're being cheered on, Matt. Congress, the whole country is happy with them. These boys are going to believe that they be heroes for looting and burning. Pause for a second. Sorry about that. I'm going to pause anyways, and I'll come back and reread part of it. So we're starting to get into that answer for, let's see which question it was. For question 2. What did Ed Turner think of the soldiers looting? So his youngest son is part of Sherman's army that is marching and looting. And so looting meaning that they're stealing other people's belongings, but not only are they stealing them, but they're also destroying them. He's part of the burning, and the way he describes it, they think it's hysterical. They're laughing and having a good time when they're ruining people's lives. Ed also points out that they're being cheered on for this because it is something that is helping the Union win the war. And he's wondering what that's going to do to his son and how that'll affect him. Does he approve of those behaviors? Absolutely not. He's worried about what those kind of actions within a war, what that will do to the young men that have gone through that are, when they come out of it, they're going to be hardened men. Are they going to care about other people, etc.? So we're right at the top of page 177. And I was just noticing the top of my page, I've written that it's already 1865. I was trying to note what month we were in, but I don't see that on my first glance down here. So anyways, Matt reassures him that you've taught him right from wrong. It'll be okay. And then we're picked up with the rest of his answer. But they're being cheered on, Matt. Congress, the whole country is happy with them. These boys are going to believe that they be heroes for looting and burning, for laughing at distress, for smashing the helpless without pity. In some ways, Sammy is more of a child than your Jeff here. He goes with the crowd without thinking. Mary and me has had to guard against that way of him. Matt looked at his friend with troubled eyes. Any words that he could think of seemed useless, worse than silence. Ed got to his feet. Well, it surely will be over soon. It's got to be over soon. The South can't hold out much longer. That was what the papers were saying too, along with the politicians and the men who congregated in little groups at the country stores. Surely it would be over soon. The South was starving, its railroads and seaports gone. Grant was only a few miles from Richmond. Thomas was in Tennessee, and Sherman was roaring up through South Carolina. Any week now, any day, any hour, the great terror that had gripped the land for 4 years would be over. Ebb wrote from Tennessee. He was with General Schofield's army, and they were marching toward North Carolina to join Sherman when he reached there. It's all going to be over soon. I figured to be home to help Jeff with the spring plowing and planting. I have not felt in such good spirits since the early days when Tom and me allowed this war was going to be pure fun. We was like foolish young'uns. But the war went on. In Virginia, more soldiers died each day in Grant's army and in Lee's because the South, even in its death throes, would not admit defeat. And the tragedy of these deaths was even greater when the hopes of homecoming and peace were just within realization. Jethro had just turned 13 in early 1865. He had grown tall during the years of the war, and although he was still slender, there was a taut look about his body, as if all his muscles had attained a fine precision in working together for the achievement of a needed strength. His face was becoming more angular, and the great blue eyes of his early years were darkened by shifting lights of gray and green. Matt and Ellen noticed a change in him. He was gentle with them and with Nancy and her children. but there was a reserve about him that had grown steadily greater with the years. They watched him anxiously, wondering and sometimes fearing a little. He was so much like Bill. And Bill, the gentlest of all their sons, had walked out of their lives with a finality that cut like a knife. To lose Jethro would have been too much. Unconsciously, they clutched at him. It's been long since you have told me any of the old lessons Shad used to learn you, Jeff, his mother remarked one morning as she sat before the fire watching him pace aimlessly. He took a handful of crumbs and tossed them out to the sparrows that hopped on crusted snowdrifts outside. When he came back, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Seems sometimes that the old lessons are being lost in the worry of new things happening each day, Ma, he said quietly. Somehow I don't have the heart for things that used to set me up so much. What was on your mind just now, Jeff, while you was pacing back and forward? I guess I was thinking of some things Mr. Milton said the last time he spent the night with us. Things about the war and peace when it comes. Do you want to tell me of them? I'd be proud to hear the things that are in your mind. Jethro felt a wrench of pity at her little plea, but he stood before her silent and troubled. I can't put it the way Mr. Milton does, Ma, he explained after a while. I can't make you understand. Some things he says I don't quite understand either. I just have a feeling for him. And I can't form the thoughts into good words. Ellen nodded meekly. There were indeed many things that she could not understand. Most of Ross Milton's talk was beyond her comprehension. But it was having Jethro talk to her that she wanted, not an understanding of Ross Milton's words. Jethro walked slowly out of the house. The look in his mother's eyes troubled him. So did the things the editor had talked about on a recent night when he and Jethro sat before the fire in the cabin, after Matt's weariness had forced him off to bed. Don't expect peace to be a perfect pearl, Jeth, Ross Milton had warned. So there's the poetry. Don't expect peace to be a perfect pearl. That gives us two types of figurative language. Now, we didn't have a chance to cover figurative language together. We skipped that unit. Ugh. We'll make sure we cover it double next year, I guess. But I bet some of the things I'm going to say to you, you know these anyways. So peace be a perfect pearl, that repetition of what is that called? Do we know? Alliteration is one, meaning that it's going to stand out so that we can hear that within there. But it's also a comparison. It does not use like or as, so it's comparing peace to a pearl. And usually we think of a pearl, you know, a perfect round white ball. That is a metaphor. He starts to explain it below, so let's read his explanation first, and then I'll try to explain it a little bit more as well. This is a land lying in destruction, physical and spiritual. If the twisted railroads and the burned cities and the fields covered with the bones of dead men, if that were all, we could soon rise out of the destruction. But the hate that burns in old scars, and the thirst for revenge that has distorted men until they should be in straitjackets rather than in high office. These are the things that may make peace a sorry thing. So I'm not sure if you're aware how a pearl is formed. So it's inside an oyster, there's a shell, and in the oyster is actually a living creature, and usually some sand gets in there, and that oyster kind of keeps working at that sand, and it turns it into that pearl. So when we're talking about peace here, that war would be the hard times, so that it's kind of gone through, that we're working at trying to get this to a better place. But it's not going to be a perfect pearl, because it's not like we're all of a sudden that pearl is going to be spit out of the oyster and then ta-da, everything is wonderful. It's going to be a little bit harder because there's so many hard feelings. And he mentions that, the South is not going to take this easily. They're going to want revenge. There are, not even the South, but the North as well. They're not going to quickly forgive the way that the other side had treated. I think it's going to be the same on both sides. They're going to struggle. They're going to hate. It's not going to, just because the war was won, there's going to be immediate peace. It's going to be a difficult thing for our country to get through, is what he's hinting at. I'm going to continue a little bit further, and then we'll take a break for today. So we're about halfway down 179. Jethro had not liked to hear the editor talk like that. To him, peace had been a shining dream, with Shad and Jenny back home, with John more of a brother now and a hero in Jethro's eyes, with Eb coming home in pride instead of degradation. No, of course, peace would not be a perfect pearl. Not with young Tom never to return. Not with the possibility of Bill's return, only the most shadowy and remote of chances. Still, peace would mean a glorious sense of relief. In all of his years, Jethro had heard either the talk of war's imminence or its reality. So his whole life they were talking about war's going to happen, and then it did, and it was real. He had wished that Ross Milton would not rip up his dream of peace. He had said to the editor that night, "But we have the president, Mr. Milton. Don't you remember the last of his speech a few weeks ago on Inauguration Day? To bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who should have borne the battle. Won't the president do away with the hate and revenge that you're telling me about?" Ross Milton had taken a brand from the fireplace carefully between his long fingers, and he waited until he had lighted his pipe before answering Jethro's question. "My hope lies in Abraham Lincoln. He has 4 years before him and the power of a mighty office, if he can control the bigots, if he can allow the defeated their dignity and a chance to rise out of their despair. If he can do this, then maybe peace will not be a mockery." They had talked of the 13th Amendment that night. Did we get that far in social studies? Did we learn what the 13th Amendment is? Let's see. It had been passed by Congress, and now it was up to the states. Illinois had already ratified it. Jethro felt proud that his state was the first to do so, and there was little doubt that 3/4 of the others would follow. Then slavery would be constitutionally abolished once and for all. So the 13th Amendment is freeing the slaves. It's a great thing, isn't it, Mr. Milton? It's a far star, Jeth. It's a dim pinpoint of light in the darkness. There he goes again. He describes it as a far star. What does he mean? Let's see if we can figure it out. I'll explain a little more and then we'll stop for today. Jethro had been provoked. "I don't know why you talk like that," he exclaimed. The editor reached out and put his hand on Jethro's knee. "Because, Jeth, after the 13th Amendment has become part of our Constitution, and for years afterward, 25, maybe 50, there will be men and women with dark faces who will walk the length and width of this land in search of the bright promise the 13th Amendment holds out to them." He turned with a sudden thrust of his crippled body to Jethro. "What's going to happen to them, Jeth? What will become of men and women who have known nothing but servitude all the days of their lives? They are without experience, without education. They'll be pawns in the hands of exploiters all over the nation. You watch this thing, Jeth. You watch the abolitionists who have ranted against the South. See if they extend the hand of friendship to the uneducated, unskilled men who will come north looking for them as to a savior. Look what has happened in our own armies. Our soldiers have been angered by the dark man who has assumed they were his friends. Sure, the North has talked loudly against slavery. I have joined in that talk. But I tell you, all of us are getting a little quieter when the question comes up as to what we are to do about the products of slavery. So I am going to pause there because the 13th Amendment, so it frees the slaves. Now he calls this a far star. That conversation actually continues a little bit more, and we'll pick it up there tomorrow as well. But you get the gist of it right here, that it's a far star because it's not like it's going to be an immediate answer. All right, we freed the slaves and our country is better for it. What's going to happen to the slaves? Are they going to be able to get jobs up in the North? They don't have an education. They don't have skills other than the things, what they've done on the farms, or where they've been a slave. So being of service is the only thing that they have known what to do up until this point. And are the people of the North going to be welcoming of them? It doesn't sound like they necessarily will be. They realize maybe that slavery was not a good thing, but now how to handle it. So there's going to be all of these problems, and Ross Milton is seeing those ahead of time. I'm going to pause here because I think I've already crossed my 20-minute mark. I forgot to set my timer, but we also got interrupted by kids twice. So I'm not fully sure how long it was. We'll wrap this up tomorrow or the next day. I'm not sure how many days it'll take us, but have a great day today. Get done what you can of your questions. Remember, capital letters, complete sentences, periods, specific details, explain. You have to explain those answers that we just talked about. You can't just put the figurative language part of what Ross Milton says. Have a great day.